A lot has happened recently that will have a significant impact on lumber prices in the future, including changes in interest rates, increased tariffs on Canadian lumber, mill closures, and even hurricanes. So what impact will all of this have on lumber prices going forward? Stick around and I'll explain. So far this year, lumber prices are down. They were at their lowest in July at $464 per thousand board feet, and were at their highest in March at $617 per thousand board feet. Right now they're sitting slightly below the average of those two, but when we compare to previous years, this year looks pretty good, but that may be changing soon. We all know that lumber prices in the US are linked to the housing market, as it can take a lot of lumber to build a new home. The average US home uses around 15,000 board feet of framing lumber or 2x4s, which at current wholesale prices would cost around $8,000. In previous years, it could have cost as much as $25,000, and that's just for framing lumber, not counting plywood and OSB. Now, with inflation hitting everyone hard and mortgage rates being high, people have not been buying lumber for remodels and fewer new homes are being built. And this is causing a decrease in the demand for lumber, and so lumber prices are down from their highs. To illustrate that better, here is a graph of housing starts for the past 2 years or so. Home building peaked in early 2022, but has been down ever since. Also, the homes that are being built are actually getting smaller. And that means that we're actually using less lumber for the homes that we are building. All of this has had a detrimental effect on the lumber industry, and there have been a large number of mill closures and curtailments across the country. In fact, here are a few comments I've received from some of my viewers. One guy simply said, "I'm a logger. Lumber isn't selling. We're laying off at the mills and canceling logging contracts." Another guy said, "I worked at a sawmill in southern Ohio for over 14 years, and last March they shut it down." Another guy said this, "I work at a Georgia Pacific lumber mill. We just got the news that we'll no longer run logs and only run studs, displacing 106 jobs." So these are stories of lower demand, mill closures, and changes in production at the lumber mills, which they are forced to do in order to save money and to stay profitable. The effect of all this, though, is that the capacity of the market, the amount that the lumber mills can produce, has gone down significantly. Now, to be clear, this isn't really a problem when demand is low, because generally that supply meets the demand. But if demand changes and demand increases, that could be a problem. Well, we'll get to that in just a minute, but there is something else that we need to talk to that is going to have a more immediate impact on lumber prices, and that is lumber tariffs. Now, lumber tariffs may sound like a super boring topic, and maybe it is, but there was an increase in lumber tariffs recently, and it ultimately hits your wallet, and so it's important to understand what's going on. And so let me explain. Here is the idea, generally. In Canada, most lumber is harvested from public lands, or what they call crown lands. In the US, most lumber comes from private lands. And the US lumber industry complains that the Canadian government is unfairly subsidizing its lumber industry by keeping the fees that loggers pay for timber low. In the US, they pay private rates. In Canada, they pay those public rates. And so that's the difference. And in the eyes of US lumber producers, this gives Canadian lumber companies an unfair advantage, which hurts the US business. So what do the US companies do? Well, they press the US government to apply tariffs to Canadian lumber. A tariff is a tax that's paid by importers when a good like lumber is imported into the country. These tariffs do a couple of things. First, they increase the cost of Canadian lumber, which makes US lumber more attractive to consumers. It also allows US producers to charge more for their product than they generally would be able to, simply because the alternatives coming in from Canada are more expensive. The US and Canada have been playing this game for decades now, and most recently, the Biden administration nearly doubled the tariffs on Canadian lumber from 8.05% to 14.54%. That is quite the jump. Now, here's the really crazy thing about lumber tariffs. They're really just a huge scam. What usually happens, and what has happened many times in the past, is that the Canadian lumber companies file complaints with the U.S. Court of International Trade and the World Trade Organization, saying that the tariffs that the U.S. is imposing violate international trade law, which they do. And so the Canadians usually win, which means that the U.S. is forced to pay back Canadian lumber companies. So I know that was a lot, so let me just explain that one more time. The US slaps a tariff on Canadian lumber, the price of lumber goes up for everyone, and American consumers pay more. The US lumber companies make more money because they're able to charge higher prices, and then ultimately the US government, who again usually loses in these disputes, is forced to pay Canadian lumber companies back. So let me ask you this question: who gets screwed in this exchange? That's right, it's the American consumer. All of us, we end up paying more. The US lumber companies are fine, the Canadian lumber companies maybe went through some pain, but ultimately they're fine. And we're the ones that end up holding the bag. Now it gets even worse than that though, because for the past 10, 20 years, Canadian lumber companies have been expanding their operations to the US and buying up farmland and mills in the South, in the Northwest. Companies like West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor are all Canadian companies that now have extensive operations in the US. So they take advantage of that game on both sides of the border. So tariffs definitely increase prices, but let's get back to lumber supply and demand. So as I mentioned before, lumber prices are linked to US home construction, and demand for housing has been low recently due to high home prices and low interest rates. It's not that there's not a lot of people that need housing, but it's that those prices are just so high that the people that want housing can't afford it. Well, as you probably know, the Federal Reserve met recently and lowered interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. Now, just to be clear, the Fed funds rate, which is the rate that the Federal Reserve has lowered, is not the same thing as mortgage rates, but they are definitely related. And generally, when the Fed funds rate comes down, so do mortgage rates. So with the Fed funds rate coming down, mortgage rates are also coming down. And so are housing prices in some areas. In fact, across the country, the median home price is down by almost 7% since a high back in 2022. Of course, that's not true everywhere, but there are some markets where prices are actually down. So a decrease in home prices and a decrease in interest rates mean it's going to be easier for people to purchase a home. And this will likely lead to an increase in home building and therefore a higher demand for lumber. And then there is the issue of the recent hurricanes. There has been extensive damage that is going to require a lot of rebuilding, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a few months for that rebuilding to really start taking place in earnest and to really impact the lumber market as a whole. But here's the thing. Lumber demand is going to go up, and when it does inevitably go up and there's a lack of supply and capacity due to mill closures and curtailments, this will lead to an increase in prices. And that's in addition to the lumber tariffs that we already talked about before, which will also increase prices. Basically, what this means is that right now, all of the indicators are currently pointing to higher lumber prices. Now, I don't think it's going to happen right away, though, because we're right now nearing the end of the building season. But I predict that starting early next year, we're going to see a spike in lumber prices, especially if rates come down even more over the next few months. So what do you guys think? Do you think that prices are headed up? Please leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to read it. Also, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I'll keep you up to date on lumber prices, where they are and where they're going, and what's going on in the industry. Also, be sure to check out this video on Craftsman tools and what happened to them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.